The year was 216 BC and Rome faced its greatest nightmare in Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian genius who crossed the Alps to bring fire and blood to the gates of the Republic, leading the Roman Senate to raise a massive army of 80,000 men to crush him once and for all through sheer brute force. As the two consuls Paulus and Varro marched this sea of bronze and red shields toward the dusty plains of Cannae under a scorching sun that promised only death, while Hannibal watched with a cold and calculating gaze, knowing that Roman arrogance would be their downfall. As he positioned his outnumbered troops in a deceptive crescent formation with his weakest soldiers in the center as bait and his elite African infantry on the wings like a trap ready to snap shut. A move so subtle that the Romans saw only a fragile enemy waiting to be trampled, unaware they were marching into a choreographed slaughterhouse where their superior numbers would soon become a fatal cage. And as the Roman trumpets blared and the dust rose in choking clouds, the legionaries charged forward with a deafening roar, fueled by a desperate need for revenge and the belief in their own invincibility. Not realizing that they were about to witness a tactical masterpiece that would leave the fields of Cannae soaked in the blood of tens of thousands and change the course of history forever. As the two empires collided in a cacophony of clashing metal and screams that signaled the beginning of a disaster, so profound it would haunt the Roman psyche for 1,000 years. For at Cannae, the genius of one man was about to prove that numbers mean nothing if the mind is outmatched. As the massive Roman formation moved forward like a wall of iron, the sheer weight of 80,000 boots hitting the parched earth of Cannae created a low, rhythmic thundering that could be felt miles away, while the Roman consuls, specifically the impulsive Varro, saw the thin and bulging center of Hannibal's line as a sign of weakness and cowardice, leading him to order the legions to tighten their ranks even further into a deep, narrow column that maximized frontal impact but sacrificed lateral flexibility, a decision that played perfectly into Hannibal's hands as the Roman infantry, composed of battle-hardened veterans and eager raw recruits, crashed into the Gallic and Spanish tribesmen in the Carthaginian center with a violence that was visceral and immediate, sending a spray of blood and splintered wood into the hot morning air. Yet instead of holding firm or breaking completely, Hannibal's center began a slow, deliberate, and disciplined retreat, stepping back inch by inch under the immense Roman pressure while maintaining their formation, which gave the Roman soldiers a false sense of impending victory and lured them deeper and deeper into the heart of the Carthaginian lines, causing the Roman masses to pour into the widening gap with a collective roar of triumph that drowned out the cautious warnings of the veteran officers, as the soldiers in the rear pushed those in the front so aggressively that the Roman formation began to lose its cohesion and became a dense, suffocating mob where men were packed so tightly they could barely raise their shields or swing their swords with full force, while on the flanks, the elite Carthaginian and Spanish cavalry engaged the Roman horsemen in a brutal and decisive struggle that saw the Roman wings shattered and driven from the field, leaving the sides of the massive infantry block exposed to the tactical genius of the Carthaginian commander, who stood calmly on a nearby hill observing every movement of this human tide, knowing that the trap was halfway closed and that the Roman obsession with a frontal breakthrough was blinding them to the two elite African heavy infantry divisions that remained stationary and hidden on the wings, waiting for the precise moment when the Roman advance had pushed far enough to be completely surrounded. As the dust and the heat of the Apulian summer began to take their toll on the heavily armored legionaries, who were now gasping for breath and blinded by the grit, being blown into their eyes by the Vulturnus wind, unaware that the very ground they were conquering was becoming their cage. As Hannibal signaled his elite units to prepare for the final maneuver that would turn a standard battle into a systematic extermination of the Roman military elite, while the screams of the wounded and the frantic commands of the centurions created a chaotic symphony of war that signaled the end of the beginning and the start of a nightmare from which few would ever wake. For the Roman strength was now their greatest liability, as they became a paralyzed giant being slowly devoured from within by a mastermind who viewed the battlefield as a canvas of death. And the air itself seemed to thicken with the copper scent of blood as the first few thousands of casualties began to pile up in the center, creating a gruesome carpet of flesh that tripped the advancing Romans and slowed their momentum even further, while the Gallic warriors in Hannibal's center laughed with a manic ferocity as they traded blows with the disciplined Romans, their wild hair and tattooed bodies clashing with the polished bronze of the Republic. But this was all part of the grand design where every Roman step forward was a step toward a strategic abyss that had no bottom, as Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal led the heavy cavalry in a devastating sweep that cleared the Roman rear of any protection, ensuring that once the trap snapped shut there would be no escape for the 80,000 souls trapped in the dusty bowl of Cannae. And the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows but only a harsh light on the carnage that was about to transition from a battle of empires into a massacre of such proportions that it would become the gold standard for military annihilation for the next 2,000 years of human history. Step 3. The trap snaps shut and the encirclement of the legions. The momentum of the Roman advance had now become its own executioner, as the 80,000 legionaries, driven by a primal urge to crush the retreating Carthaginian center, surged forward with such uncontrolled ferocity that they completely ignored the shifting geometry of the battlefield, failing to realize that Hannibal's line had transformed from a convex bulge into a concave trap, while the two elite divisions of African heavy infantry, who had remained perfectly still and fresh on the wings like coiled vipers, now received the silent signal from Hannibal to pivot inward, a maneuver executed with surgical precision that effectively turned the Roman flanks into a slaughterhouse, as these disciplined veterans crashed into the sides of the dense Roman column with a force that sent shockwaves through the entire mass of men, while simultaneously the Carthaginian heavy cavalry, having completely decimated the Roman horsemen and pursued them from the field, now reappeared in a cloud of dust at the Roman rear, slamming into the exposed back of the infantry block to complete the perfect double envelopment. A feat of tactical genius so absolute that it turned the vast Roman army into a giant, paralyzed beast that could no longer move, breathe, or defend itself effectively, as the sheer density of the crowd meant that soldiers in the middle were lifted off their feet by the pressure of their own comrades, while those on the outer edges were hacked down by a merciless circle of iron and steel that grew tighter with every passing second, creating a terrifying psychological panic as the realization dawned on the Roman officers that there was no way out and no room to maneuver their legendary maniples, turning the disciplined Roman war machine into a chaotic and suffocating mob where men were forced to stand face to face with death in a space so cramped they could not even raise their arms to strike back, while the hot Vulturnus wind continued to blast grit into their weeping eyes and the sun beat down on their bronze helmets until the metal burned their skin, all while Hannibal watched with a cold, unblinking focus, knowing that he had achieved the impossible by surrounding a vastly superior force with a smaller one, a strategic miracle that was now transitioning into a systematic and industrial-scale extermination of the Roman youth, as the ground beneath their feet turned into a slippery mire of blood and entrails that made every movement a struggle for survival, and the sounds of the battle shifted from the rhythmic clashing of shields to a sickening, wet thud of blades hitting flesh and the low, collective moan of thousands of men realizing they were about to be erased from the face of the earth, while the African infantry, armed with captured Roman equipment from previous victories, looked like the very ghosts of the men they had already killed, adding a layer of supernatural terror to the physical agony of the trapped legions. And as the perimeter of the Roman force began to collapse inward like a dying star, the center of the mass became a vacuum of despair where men began to dig holes in the sand and bury their heads to suffocate themselves rather than face the slow, agonizing death of the sword, marking the moment when the military pride of the Republic was replaced by a raw, naked struggle for a few more seconds of breath in a landscape that had become a monument to the genius of Hannibal and the tragic arrogance of Rome, as the blood began to flow in small rivulets toward the Aufidus River, coloring the water a dark crimson that warned the villages downstream that the world they knew had just come to a violent and bloody end. And still the Carthaginian circle tightened, a ring of steel that had no gaps and offered no mercy, as Hannibal's multi-ethnic army of Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans worked together with the harmony of a well-oiled machine to harvest the lives of the men who had come to conquer them, proving that in the hands of a master, the battlefield is not a place of chance but a place of absolute and terrifying design. The battle had now devolved from a strategic engagement into a primitive and industrial-scale harvest of human lives, as the density of the Roman mass became so extreme that men were literally crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades before a Carthaginian blade could even reach them, while the elite African infantry on the flanks and the Gallic and Spanish warriors in the center began the slow and methodical process of hacking their way through the outer layers of the Roman giant. Task that required such physical exertion that the soldiers had to take turns stepping back to catch their breath while their replacements continued the butchery, creating a rhythmic and sickening cycle of violence that turned the field of Cannae into a literal slaughterhouse where the air was thick with the metallic stench of opened bellies and the high-pitched screams of horses and men alike, while in the midst of this chaos, the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, despite being severely wounded by a sling stone early in the engagement, refused to flee and instead dismounted his horse to fight and die alongside his men in a final gesture of aristocratic stoicism. A sight that inspired those around him to fight with a suicidal bravery that only served to prolong their agony because there was no tactical escape and no hope of reinforcement, whereas the other consul Varro, seeing the total collapse of his grand ambition and the destruction of the army he had so arrogantly led into this trap, managed to break through the thinning lines with a small group of cavalry and flee the field, an act of perceived cowardice that would forever stain his name in the annals of Roman history. Yet for the tens of thousands trapped in the tightening circle of steel, there was no such escape as the Carthaginian warriors began to target the Roman officers and tribunes specifically, stripping the legions of their leadership and leaving the rank-and-file soldiers as a leaderless and terrified mob, while the heat of the afternoon sun intensified the suffering of the parched and exhausted Romans who had been fighting for hours without water or rest, their bronze armor now acting as an oven that baked them alive while they slipped and fell on the gore-slicked earth, only to be trampled by the desperate movements of the men behind them who were trying to push away from the encroaching blades. And as the perimeter continued to shrink, the Roman soldiers were forced to stand so close to their enemies that they could see the sweat on their brows and smell the breath of the men who were about to kill them. A level of psychological trauma that broke the spirit of even the most decorated veterans who had survived the bloody encounters at Trebia and Trasimene. While Hannibal remained a calm and distant figure on his horse, directing the final stages of the encirclement with the cold efficiency of a grandmaster finishing a game of chess, knowing that every Roman life taken here was a blow to the very foundation of the Republic and a step toward the total dominance of Carthage in the Mediterranean world. And the pile of Roman corpses grew so high in certain areas that the Carthaginian soldiers had to climb over mounds of the dead to reach the living, creating a surreal and macabre landscape where the boundaries between the earth and human flesh seemed to disappear, as the blood of the Roman elite, including 80 senators and dozens of former consuls and praetors, mixed with the dust of the Apulian plain, signifying the decapitation of the Roman political and military class in a single afternoon of unprecedented carnage that would leave the city of Rome defenseless and trembling in fear of the name Hannibal for generations to come. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long and distorted shadows over the mountains of the slain, a silent testament to the fact that the Roman war machine, for all its discipline and power, had finally met a mind that it could not outfight, outmuscle, or outlast, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the wet thud of steel on bone to fill the void where a superpower's army once stood in all its pride. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the plains of Apulia, the deafening roar of battle finally faded into a haunting and heavy silence, broken only by the low moans of the dying and the scavenging cries of crows that descended in their thousands to feast on the greatest harvest of human flesh the ancient world had ever seen, while the once proud Roman legions lay in literal mountains of the dead, with nearly 50,000 bodies carpeting the earth in a grisly mosaic of bronze, leather, and crimson, representing the lost youth and the shattered leadership of a republic that had thought itself invincible but now lay decapitated and bleeding in the dust, as the Carthaginian soldiers, exhausted and covered from head to toe in the dried gore of their enemies, moved slowly across the field to strip the fallen of their valuables, collecting thousands of gold rings from the fingers of Roman knights and senators to be sent back to Carthage as proof of a victory so absolute it defied belief, while Hannibal himself walked among the ruins of his enemy's ambition, his face a mask of cold satisfaction but also deep fatigue, knowing that while he had won the most perfect tactical battle in history, he now faced the daunting task of what to do with a victory that had left the road to Rome wide open yet filled with the political complexities of a long and grinding war, as the few thousand Roman survivors who had managed to escape the slaughter huddled in the nearby woods or fled toward the fortresses of Canusium and Venusia, their spirits so broken and their trauma so deep that they were described as walking ghosts who had looked into the abyss and seen the end of their world. While back in the Carthaginian camp, the diverse tribes of Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans celebrated with a ferocity that mirrored the violence of the day, their bonds forged in the blood of the legions and their loyalty to Hannibal cemented by the sight of the Roman giant lying dead at their feet. Yet even in the moment of triumph, a tension began to simmer among the Carthaginian high command as the cavalry leader Maharbal urged Hannibal to march immediately on Rome itself, famously telling his general that he knew how to win a victory but not how to use one, a criticism that would echo through history as the great what-if of the Punic Wars, while the local Italian populations watched from a distance in absolute terror, realizing that the power of Rome had been shattered like a clay pot and that they were now at the mercy of a foreign conqueror who moved with the precision of a god of war. And as the night air turned cold, the smell of the battlefield became an unbearable stench that drifted for miles, a mixture of iron and decay that served as a physical reminder of the cost of empire and the fragile nature of human glory. For at Cannae, the Roman Republic had not just lost a battle, but had lost its sense of security and its belief in the permanence of its walls, leaving a vacuum of power and a psychological wound that would never fully heal. As the names of the fallen were whispered in the dark by their comrades, who wondered why they were the ones left alive to tell a story that no one back home would want to believe, because the scale of the disaster was so vast that it seemed to belong to the realm of myth rather than the reality of a single afternoon. And as the moon rose over the silent heaps of the slain, the Roman eagle lay face down in the dirt, its wings clipped by the genius of a man who had turned a dusty plain into the altar of a superpower's sacrifice. As news of the total annihilation at Cannae reached the city of Rome, the streets were transformed from a place of bustling commerce and political debate into a landscape of primal, unadulterated terror, as the initial rumors of a defeat were replaced by the staggering reality that the largest army in the history of the Republic had been wiped off the face of the earth in a single afternoon, leaving nearly every household in the city in mourning and every family searching for names that would never return, creating a collective scream of grief that was said to have reached the very heavens and caused the Senate to momentarily lose its grip on order as the physical defense of the city now rested on the shoulders of old men, boys, and even slaves who were desperately armed with ancient weapons taken from the walls of temples, while the high priestess of the Vestal Virgins was found to have broken her vows in an omen of divine abandonment, leading the panicked Roman authorities to perform a ritual so dark and rare it signaled the end of their civilized world. The burying alive of a Greek and a Gallic couple in the Forum Boreum as a blood sacrifice to appease the gods who seemed to have turned their faces toward Carthage, while the streets were cleared of women who were forbidden from weeping in public to prevent the total collapse of morale among the few soldiers left to man the gates, and the remaining senators under the iron leadership of Fabius Maximus worked in a feverish state of emergency to declare a state of perpetual mourning, while simultaneously forbidding the word peace from being whispered in the city air. As they braced for the sight of Hannibal's cavalry appearing on the horizon to deliver the final blow to a city that had no army left to stop him, creating a psychological tension so thick it felt like a physical weight on the chest of every Roman citizen who watched the horizon with tear-streaked faces and shaking hands. While in the halls of power, the Roman elite realized that their entire social and military structure had been decapitated, and that the very survival of the Roman identity was now a question of hours rather than days. As they waited for the shadow of the Carthaginian elephants to fall upon the Tiber and for the name of Rome to be erased from the maps of the world, yet even in this moment of absolute darkness, a small spark of the legendary Roman stubbornness began to flicker as the survivors of the massacre began to trickle back into the city, not as cowards but as the foundation of a new and harder Rome that would refuse to surrender even when the ground beneath them was soaked in their own blood. A resilience born from the realization that they had already been to the gates of hell and had nothing left to lose but their lives, while the rest of Italy watched in stunned silence, wondering if the Wolf of Rome was finally dead, or if it was merely cornered and more dangerous than ever before, as the city prepared itself for a siege that seemed both inevitable and hopeless in a world where Hannibal Barca had proven that no Roman shield was strong enough to hold back the tide of his genius. The slaughter at Cannae did not end the war, but instead acted as a brutal, bloody forge that hammered the Roman Republic into an entirely different and more terrifying entity. For while any other nation of the ancient world would have sued for peace after losing the equivalent of an entire generation of its elite, the Romans responded with a savage and fanatical refusal to even acknowledge the possibility of defeat, a defiance that saw them implement a total war economy where every resource was diverted to the military, and new legions were raised from the very bottom of society, teaching the Roman leadership that to defeat a genius like Hannibal they could no longer rely on the predictable brute force of their ancestors, but must instead evolve their own tactical flexibility and strategic patience, leading to the rise of Scipio Africanus, who studied Hannibal's maneuvers at Cannae with clinical obsession to eventually turn those same lessons against Carthage on the sands of Zama years later. But the psychological scar of that one afternoon in Apulia remained etched into the Roman soul for a millennium, ensuring that the name Hannibal would be used by Roman mothers to frighten their children into silence for centuries, and that the Roman military doctrine would forever prioritize the complete and total destruction of an enemy over mere territorial gain, as Cannae became the ultimate cautionary tale of the dangers of military arrogance and the catastrophic price of underestimating a brilliant adversary, serving as a permanent reminder that even a superpower can be brought to its knees by the mind of a single man. Yet in its survival of this disaster, Rome found the ironclad resolve that would eventually allow it to conquer the entire Mediterranean basin and beyond, turning the site of its greatest shame into the foundation of its greatest glory. For without the hard lessons learned in the blood-soaked dust of Cannae, the Roman Empire as we know it might never have existed, as the disaster forced a primitive agrarian republic to become a professionalized and global military machine that would not suffer another defeat of such magnitude for hundreds of years, making the field of Cannae not just a graveyard for 80,000 souls, but the birthplace of an imperial destiny written in the blood of the fallen. And as the centuries passed and the bones of the legionaries turned to dust beneath the Italian soil, the story of the one man who stood against 100,000 and the general who trapped an army in a circle of steel became the gold standard for every military commander from Caesar to Napoleon, a haunting and eternal testament to the fact that in the theater of war the most powerful weapon is not the sword or the shield but the cold and calculating human mind. And though the Roman Republic eventually faded into the mists of history, the echoes of the screams at Cannae still resonate as a chilling warning that pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. The fields of Cannae eventually fell silent, and the dust of Apulia settled over the bodies of 50,000 brave souls. But the echoes of that afternoon didn't just fade away. They changed the DNA of the Roman Republic forever. Rome learned that day that survival isn't just about the size of your army, but the depth of your resolve. Hannibal Barca gave the Romans their greatest lesson in the most brutal way possible. He showed them that even a superpower can be brought to its knees by the sheer force of a brilliant mind. But in trying to destroy Rome, Hannibal unintentionally forged an empire that would go on to rule the known world for centuries. So, what do you think? Was Cannae the greatest military masterpiece in history? Or was it Rome's greatest failure of leadership? And more importantly, could a disaster of this scale ever happen to a modern superpower today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the disaster at Cannae fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Battle Memoirs. We travel back to the most intense, heart-pounding moments of human history every week, and you won't want to miss our next episode on the fall of empires and the rise of legends. I'm your host, and this has been a journey through the blood-soaked sands of 216 BC. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a blueprint for the future. Thanks for watching.